how valuable and how critical support functions were for the 10th Mountain to be able to go forward. By that, we're talking about the medics, the engineers,
Yeah,
the
well,
quartermasters, the artillerymen.
you got several others too. But, well, I guess it's hard to visualize unless you are there or have been near that sort of thing. But the support units like the quartermaster and the engineers were what kept the fight going. The engineers build roads. They had a group of one company of our 126 engineers was trained in clearing minefields. And you know how they did it? They went out in front of the tanks and took care of the road on both sides so that the tanks didn't get blown up. Oddly enough, these engineers didn't get blown up either, but they were very, very good. A few of them got hurt. But here they are out yards, maybe half a mile, a quarter of a mile, out in front of the troops, clearing the way for tanks. The troops might have been out in front too, but they hadn't gone the same way. And so they were only the recipient of tank and armor support because of the engineers. And of course the engineers also built the roads or rebuilt the roads. They put up bridges where bridges had been blown up. The most famous thing in 10th history was the what do you call it? Tramway, yeah, which was unique because the only one, well, there was another one in our area. It was the only time that those things had been used in the European theater during the war. The Signal Corps people.
Talk a little bit about how critical the quartermaster, the role of the quartermaster was.
Well, they provide the food, the clothing, and up to a point the grave registration stuff. That's the other side of it. They would have showers where you could. The men were taken in after a week or two in the field. You get pretty smelly, and the clothes are just stiff on you. They'd go to a shower, get clean new clothes. They left theirs, get new clothes, and walk out refreshed and very, very much happier than they had been when they walked in. And then often with those situations, they were then sent off to a little rest center someplace or other.
Do you think quartermasters got enough credit for everything they had to do?
No, they didn't. They were behind us. I was in the infantry, so I can speak of this without fear of being too much contradicted, but they were behind the infantry. And the infantry didn't even know they existed in many cases, the quartermasters. They brought up stuff in trucks and stacked them up in assembly areas behind the troops, and then the troops sent trucks down and took them forward. That kind of thing. It was the infantry was blind to their services. to be honest with you. The quartermaster battalion that we had in the 10th did a lot of carrying things from some point to the front lines. It could be food, it could be clothing, whatever. And they were right into the, not the thick of things, but they were right on the edge of the, but we also had bearers in the infantry battalion headquarters, a team of people who would carry water, and that was a big item, carrying water to the troops. So they acted, they were more like quartermaster people than they were infantry people. But
how about if you talk a little bit about air support? How critical was air support for the 10th?
Oh, well, we would never have been able to do what we did without it. But that's how critical it was. And the second thing, which most people overlook or underplay, is that we'd pretty much shut the German Air Force out of the air. And there were very few instances where we were attacked by German aircraft, and that was up in the Po Valley. Well, there were several things that they could do. For one thing, I mean, the Air Force was going to shoot at the ground or drop bombs. That was pretty much what it was. There was a guy, well, there were several, but called Rover Joe. You've heard of Rover Joe. Well, they, and some of them rode around in small planes up so that they could direct the fighter aircraft to the target. They could see the target, and then they'd tell them where to go. And things came up, for instance, in other ways, that suppose the Germans were falling back a little bit in front of us as we pushed them back, but were at the same time pulling together a force for counterattack. The guys up there in the air could see that happening, and then they would relay that down to Rover Joe, and he'd tell them what to do: bomb it, shoot them up, hold off, wait till they assemble, things like that. So, but we didn't know anything about that. I knew about Rover Joe. We worked with him, but we didn't know things like that were going on. And of course, it wasn't only these people that soared around in little planes that were doing it. The pilots of the attack aircraft were also aware of what they were looking at on both sides, and if they saw a whole bunch of trucks coming up, that word would get back to our artillery, for instance, or whatever, to take care of it or be aware that they were coming. Things like that. That's pretty obvious when seeing trucks, but well, they found troops on the road. Germans sending troops forward to fill the gaps where there were casualties or where they needed them. And then they were attacked by the Air Force, Air Corps.
Chronological order. Maybe you could talk a little bit about why Mount Belvedere was the keystone of the German defense system, and why was it strategically important to take Riva Ridge in order to take Belvedere?
Well, it wasn't a vital importance from a shooting out point of view. Mount Belvedere was basically an observation post that had clear sight over American troops that were along the road and onto Highway 64 and any roads that ran into it. 64 was the one. Well, there were two, but the only really important paved road in that area, and was it had become a problem because the Germans had control. They weren't just up there with field glasses enjoying the scenery. They were spotters for the artillery, and as soon as a truck came along or a man walking on the road, whatever, there would be somebody after him, a piece of artillery or whatever. So we saw that happen at a battalion headquarters. But anyway, it wasn't. That was after. Anyway, Mount Belvedere wasn't a fortress. It was an observation point, and there were hardly anybody up there. And there need not be, because we couldn't get near it. And they were dug in at the top. There was a sort of a bunker where they could, above the ground a little. They had enough room. They didn't have to get out where they could be seen by somebody flying over. Anyway, so that was extremely important because the road was needed in the attack or operation that was already being planned for the spring of 45. And without having that road in our hands, in the American hands, we couldn't even gotten started. What was the other one? The second part of it? There was two.
Well, why was Riva Ridge important
Oh.
to capturing Belvedere?
Oh. Well, that's been well misunderstood too. You need a sand table to really see. But the idea is that Fort Mount Belvedere was, you might say, the anchor of a ridge of similar mountains that were also doing a lot as observers for their artillery. But so this was looking right down to the road. Our way up, and the way that had been used before to attack, I mean, in November and I think not as far as early December, if I'm not mistaken, there were several attempts to take Mount Belvedere. And here is, this is the road, and the observers are looking this way. And the mountainside is here. So, and that's where we set up. It was pretty bare and all fired, all burned up, and whatever, all kinds of artillery holes and so on and so on. But in those attacks, operations before ours, they took heavy casualties and were forced back off the mountain before they barely got to the top. And so why? Because this is the mountain, and over here is the ridge, and in the one part of the ridge was an observation post that had complete 24-hour-a-day observation over this rather open and what should be an easy way to get up the mountain. So when they tried with the other units before us, they were caught with the artillery. The artillery isn't up there firing down. The artillery was over here someplace. They're down there, who knows, over there. So in order to stop or put a check on that situation, we had to take Riva Ridge and stop that whole thing. It was just a small area where the relatively small area where the observation posts were for the mountain, our mountain, and so that's how we did it. And the only way to get up on that mountain was determined by, well, I should go back and say that Hayes, when he was told he had this operation to break in our raw troops, went up in he was an artilleryman. So he just went out and had somebody in one of the artillery observer planes fly him over the area so he could see the whole thing. Nobody had done that before. And he discovered the ridge had this observation over the troops if they were going up that mountain on the southwest side, I think. Anyway, and well, there was no way to blow up the place. They were pretty well dug in with these observer posts. And so the only way to stop them was to go up and capture them. And that's why we had to capture. So the other side of the picture is that there weren't a lot of troops up there, not Germans. They were down here someplace. On the back side of Riva Ridge was rather smooth and gently sloped. And in contrast to the cliffs on the other side. So they didn't need to have a lot of troops up there. If anything happened, like it did, they could run troops, trucks, jeeps, whatever, along the backside of this and wipe them out. So that's why we had to go in and some force. And when we when 86 actually got a battalion on top, they were communicating with our artillery people they carried telephone wires with them all the way up and along the top, so that they had continuous communications between the top and the artillery or anybody else that they wanted to talk to. But that's the answer. So we went in and knocked that group out, and there were a couple of other groups on other mountains nearby. Not groups, but they were small, several, I don't know, 30, 40, 50 men, something like that. And they got wiped out because at that point we could get we had our own observers telling our artillery who to fire on the backside of Riva Ridge. So there again, everything was coordinated. Actually, we had at the beginning, when the quartermaster brought lots of stuff up to the beginning of the climb, and as you know, the engineers in their support built the tramway, which got food, and they were up there for, I think, 2 days without water or food in winter, which was pretty tough. I must say those guys, our guys, and that was, I knew the 86 pretty well because that's where I had started, and they were tough people. They knew how to take it in winter and weather and up the mountains. Although, oddly enough, with all the moving around and going to Texas for a while and being turned from 10,000 men to 18,000 men overnight, we had a lot of people who had never had any mountain training. And then...
Thanks. Let me ask you this. When you think about Riva Ridge in comparison to most operations, give me some idea of how remarkable an operation Riva Ridge was.
Just
Was Riva Ridge a pretty remarkable operation?
absolutely, it's I guess it's got a pretty good role in on the history of military mountaineering forever. It was incredible what they did, actually. But your question was?
Give me some perspective on how remarkable
How-
it was.
how
Was it
remar-
remarkable, and how and why?
The climb itself was remarkable. The Germans, when we were up there and got some prisoners and stuff, one officer said to have said the reason we didn't have any troops in this area was we didn't think anybody could climb up and have a significant combat unit. And apparently this was so. But we, I have to go back a little bit about not only the distinction of the operation, but how they prepared for it. And Colonel Hampton, who had the 1st Battalion at 86, had his plans. His people were the ones who found the routes up after a lot of confusion. And he apparently took a tally of the troops that he had and found that 30% of them had had no training at all in mountaineering of any sort. So, and I decided against taking just the mountaineering trained ones, which would probably cause a lot more casualties. I mean, take the best men and make casualties of them. He took his battalion back to near Lucca, I think it was, into an old stone quarry and trained them in rock climbing, mountain climbing, using ropes and everything else that they needed until they were quite efficient. So here you had, instead of 70% possibly going up. You had 100% of the men who were trained to climb that mountain.
I think you touched on something really interesting here. Talk a little bit about Colonel Hampton and what kind of leader he was, and how he inspired others.
I really can't address that. I didn't meet him, never met him. He was, when I was, I keep saying when I first landed at Camp Hale, he was battalion commander, I think. I was in Company C, so there was A, B, C, D. That was the battalion. And we saw him from time to time. He was out and about watching training and so on and so on. Not always not at a desk in the battalion headquarters. But I never met him. But I've never met anybody who hasn't thought the world of him. It's about all I can say. He took care of his men. Like I said, he took care of his men. He actually took them out of the line, trained them to climb the cliffs, and then went and climbed the cliffs. And the casualties were quite low. I think 21 killed, and maybe another 40, 50 wounded out of about 700 men. Not 700, well, battalion would be 700, but that would be the cooks and bakers and everybody
Was
else.
that lower than expected?
Oh, nobody had any idea what was going to happen. They just crossed their fingers and hoped. Yes, they didn't know what. They had a couple of people that were climbers and daredevils who went up really into the top and peeked over. They saw some Germans. And before they knew what happened, the Germans had turned around and seen them and started shooting. So they had a little firefight. And then another time, one of them slipped and fell, and some rocks made a lot of noise, and a German came over to look over, and they shot his head off. But so there were signs that the Americans were going to do something, but the Germans never expected them to send a functional combat-sized unit up that cliff, up those cliffs.
In the time that we have left, how about if we talk a little bit about the strategic importance of the March offensive?
The march.
And the idea there was to cut the German supply line and communication lines.
You just told me.
And then position the 10th to go ahead and break out towards the Po. Can you talk a little bit about the strategic importance of the March offensive?
Well, yeah, you have to look at it from several different points of view, and again, Highway 64 comes into the picture because beyond the ridge, called Belvedere Ridge at one point, there are a lot of smaller mountains to the northeast, I think, that also had observation over the highway and anything that merged with it, other road nets and so on. So the idea there was to clear that whole area of the enemy, and they did. That's what we did. So that allowed the plan to go forward. Well, let's say the planning to go forward, so that when we jumped off on April 14th, we were in control.
What was the main disadvantage of the March offensive?
Disadvantage? disadvantage? I'm not sure I could answer that.
Well, would it be a disadvantage that successful operations before that had been a surprise at night?
Oh, well, yeah, the march, it was the second part of a two-part operation, and so anyway, by the time that came along, the time came along, so those who were in charge felt it was okay, weather-wise and otherwise, the aircraft could support, and so on and so on. We just set out a standard kind of attack with the 86th on one side and the 87th on the other, and pushed down against the mountains. Well, of course, it wasn't like going down I-25. There were mountains here and mountains there, so they had to send a platoon or a company to this mountain and so on. But yeah, the idea was to get the Germans off the hills, frankly, so that they couldn't interfere with our. Let's say we were going to set up an operation. We had to bring up tons and tons of ammunition, food, clothing, whatever, behind our jump-off point. And if the Germans were sitting up there watching, we weren't doing so well.
Well, how exposed were the 10th Mountain people during that jump-off in the March offensive?
Our people, they were exposed because they were the offensive force. I don't know what you mean.
Well, was it costly in terms of lives because they were so exposed?
Yes. I don't. I mean, they operated pretty much, except for the fact that there were a lot of hills, as other infantry operations, with the artillery beginning, firing for, I don't know, 20 minutes or something like that, and then they moved on in. But the Germans really weren't expecting anything much. So it was, but it was, as it went on, it got worse because the Germans were getting in their counterattacks and whatnot. That's where it was possible for the spotters in the planes to see the Germans moving up. They knew they were going to get going. It seemed that they were going to be a counterattacking force, so they'd send in the Air Force to shoot them, blow them up. The casualties weren't all that high, but I don't remember the numbers, but less than they were for the Mount Belvedere and so on operations, which were 300 killed, I think.
How about if we talk a little bit about the April offensive and what the challenges were in that offensive, and also what was the strategic organizing principle behind the April offensive?
Well, I have to go back to the March offensive, because at the end of that offensive, which was supposed to go for several more days, but actually we had a mountain that, we being the division, had a mountain that gave a lot of access to the area going north. It was pretty high, Dallas Bay. And we also cut off their supply roads. That was in March. So at that point, we could just jump off. We thought we could just jump off and go, and they would have to be pretty good to stop us. But unfortunately, I think we were there too long. I don't know, but the Germans were well prepared for us when we jumped off.
How exposed were the 10th Mountain Troops
When?
when they jumped off at Dallas Bay?
Very exposed. Our battalion, 3rd Battalion, 85th in particular, was stymied almost from the beginning. As soon as the opening barrages of the artillery were over, we moved into an area which turned out to be heavily mined, and the Germans had machine gun nests over on heights looking down to it, and mortars aimed at it. So our troops took a lot of bad business, a lot of killed, a lot in the minefields, and our ex-senator,
Robert Dole.
yeah. Well, there seemed to be several different stories, but apparently he was knocked down by machine gunners as he moved toward to get out of that. Maybe he walked across, I don't know, that minefield. Here they were firing down. So we took a lot of casualties. The third battalion was pretty badly damaged, and we had, I think, of the 3 attacking companies, I, K, and L, I think we had about 120 or 100, at least 120 casualties that day, and they couldn't replace them, so they had to go on the way they were, and as well as they could. The next morning, well, they didn't go very far. Actually, the whole 85th had a unique kind of thing. Instead of going northeast the way that we were going along the line, the German line was along here, we were going along this way. But that meant that as we got down further and there were hills, the Germans here had full view of the attacking troops who were attacking in the wrong direction. You might say they were going. Now what happened was that the 87th, which was going this way, particularly the 87th, was exposed, or the idea was to keep it from being exposed by taking the German heights where they had observation posts and whatnot to put artillery on this group that was going this way, quite the opposite way from the one that the Germans might have expected. And our battalion was designed to, had the job, the 2nd Battalion too, of clearing the heights of these observation posts and so on, so that the 87th didn't get chewed up before they got going. So
Maybe in the time we have left, you could just summarize for me the contributions of the 10th in World War II, but also in history, a little bit wider point of view.
I don't think I have an answer for that. What we did was spectacular. I mean, I think probably be written down in military history as a remarkable division. Because we burst out of the mountains, chased the Germans across to the Po River, went across the Po Valley River without any bridges, and nobody had time to build bridges. So we paddled across in the salt boats that were a little bigger than that couch. Well, it was springtime, you remember, and the river was full. There was a lot of water, and high water, and fast currents. The Germans had to swim across, and they had to leave all their vehicles behind. Then we went pushing through into up to Lake Garda, and that was, we closed off the exit from the Po Valley to the passes up the way, on the way to Austria. That's the way to get into Austria. Anyway, so I would say pretty highly, if you take the Riva Ridge bit alone, that was a fantastic operation. That nowadays can't be repeated. You know, the new 10th Mountain people say, well, we want to get to that hill, well, take a helicopter. And if there's somebody there, they shoot at them. And then they can have helicopters that carry men. And so